Alright, so this next video here, we're supposed to name amines that are secondary and tertiary in nature. So remember, secondary and tertiary for amines is different than secondary and tertiary for alcohols, because secondary for an amine means that that nitrogen is connected to two different carbons. So I have to have branches off of that nitrogen itself. So I'm not naming the amino nitrogen group as a branch. I'm naming branches off of the amine, which is how this works. So in this case, if I was to elaborate this a little bit more, I have two branches off of that nitrogen in the middle. This one is an ethyl group. This one is an isopropyl group. So this would be called an isopropyl, it'd be called an ethyl isopropyl amine. I believe that's correct in alphabetical order. And you just do everything else similarly. Now you do have to remember that nitrogen always has at least 3 bonds. So if you're going to draw a secondary amine, you have to make sure that there's still a hydrogen here, right? Unlike for our primary amines, where there were 2 hydrogens per nitrogen, like on this last slide, now I'm going to have 1 hydrogen per nitrogen for a secondary amine because I need to have at least those 3 bonds with my nitrogen every time. Now if it's a tertiary amine, it's a little bit different, because tertiary would mean that I have 3 different things branched off of this nitrogen, right? So I could have these 3 things branched off of that nitrogen in the center, and then I just name it appropriately. I do have 3 different branches here, a methyl, an ethyl, and a propyl group, so I have to name it appropriately and try and do it in alphabetical order, so I think it goes ethyl, methyl, then propyl. Excuse me. Oops. So it's an ethyl methyl propylamine, and it also needs to have a tertiary label to it because it is tertiary. I would not have a hydrogen this time off of that nitrogen because it already has 3 bonds. It doesn't need another one. Right? I'd have a pair of electrons in there, possibly, but I don't really need to draw that in there at any given time. Not right now, at least. So secondary, tertiary, you're just going to name branches off of the nitrogen itself. They actually kind of go along with the same rules as ethers did. So an ether had an oxygen with a branch on one side and the other, so I called that diethyl ether. So if I just made that oxygen a nitrogen and maybe had another hydrogen there, that's a diethyl amine. Right? So it seems a lot like that ether type naming system. It's very similar to it. If you have more than one of the same thing, you'd still use a prefix. That's why this turned into diethyl. Whereas the other 2, you had to name every branch individually, ethyl isopropylamine or ethyl methylpropylamine, right? But every time you have an amine, you do have to classify it. But remember, the rules are different. Secondary means you have 2 carbons branched off of that nitrogen. Tertiary, you have 3. Primary only has 1. All of these on this slide, again, were primary, so if you labeled them appropriately, they'd all have 1 degree next to them. All right, so that's our common naming system.